Michael, thanks for taking the time and coming on the show.
You bet. Thanks a lot, Mike. I appreciate it.
We are going to talk about how to make the move from just communicating with a donor via email or mail or events and move into a personal one-on-one relationship. And I want to start our conversation just by framing it this way for the benefit of our audience, because we don't get into major donor fundraising a whole lot on this podcast. There's just so many others who do that a lot better. But a lot of the people who listen to this podcast kind of wear a lot of hats. They're in medium-sized shops. They are often in charge of what you call lane one and lane two. So they're often in charge of the one-to-many communications, but they're also in charge of the one-to-one communications. And they're torn into different directions all day long. And in fact, it's one of the reasons that we founded Build Good and why we focus on direct response and donor communications. It's not because we think it's the best way to grow. In fact, not at all. Like generally speaking, and depending on the cause, we only suggest you should spend 20 to 30% of your fundraising budget on direct marketing, and the rest should go into relationship fundraising, or responsive fundraising, as you call it. We also think that a lot of organizations should not be doing direct response in-house, and they should not be doing a lot of this stuff in-house. Let us, or an agency like us, worry about that. You know, your digital, your newsletters, your direct mail, all of that stuff that is very tactical, takes a lot of time, it's very technical. Let somebody else do that, like outsource that. And then stop hiring technical players to work in-house and start hiring relationship players who are going to get on the phone with donors, who are going to leave the office, who are going to start building messy, human, unpredictable one-on-one relationships with donors, right? So that's our value prop. And that's why I'm excited to talk to you about, because you're actually going to give us a framework for how people can do that, how they can move from the one-to-many to the one-to-one. And you have a sense-making device at Responsive Fundraising that I'm hoping you can explain to us. It's a 3-lane approach. Lane 1 is prospective donors. Lane 2 is current donors. Lane 3 is critical few. So let's start there. What are these 3 lanes? Help us visualize them, and maybe give us a bit of an explanation of what each lane looks like.
Sure. And we talk about the lanes, and we talk about them in a lot of different ways. You did a really nice job of articulating lane 1 is one-to-many communication. Lane 2 is one-to-one communication. Lane 3 is also one-to-one in a slightly different way. Another way to think about this is to think about the donor's intentionality of the gift. Often we call lane 1 gifts trivial gifts. Many people push back on us about that because they say, well, all gifts are important and all dollars are relevant and we need everybody to be involved. And we don't dispute that. But what we're asking our clients and the industry to think about is, what is the meaning of the gift from the giver's perspective? And we think about that in lane 1. Those are, I got an email, I was walking into the grocery store and somebody approached me. I went to an event that I was invited by a friend to go to an event, and maybe I don't really care about the cause so much as I was excited by the speaker or the performer that was going to be there. My gift, it's important to the receiver because it's value, but it didn't have a huge meaning to me. The one-to-one gift, that one-to-many gift, that I just made this gift for some other reason, that's a lane 1 gift. And our challenge as fundraisers is to figure out which of those one-to-many gifts, which of those trivial gifts can we entice into a relationship, a conversation, a one-to-one conversation, where we can make the giving more meaningful, which of course would mean either growing it in total size or in annual size or in commitment over time. But those things don't happen necessarily because of mailings or emailings or events. They happen because of meaningful, relational, responsive communications. So I think we talk about it from a planning standpoint with our clients about what you do in lane 1. Lane 1 is direct response or it's events. Lane 2 is having coffee or lunch with a specific donor. But it's less important about what we do than it is to think about it from the giver's perspective. Right. How engaged was the donor? And so your description of first gift versus repeat gift, that's an important metric to think about. but I'm much more interested in knowing whether the second gift was made for a purpose.
Right.
I go to a certain gala every year because I have a friend that buys a table and he takes me.
Right.
And I write a check because I know that's part of the transactional obligation. But my
Sure.
obligation is almost more to my friend than to the cause. Or
Yeah.
a golf outing where I play the golf event because I want to play that course. By the way, I'm a bad golfer, but I love wonderful golf courses. So if I got a chance to pay a few $100s and I help a cause, but my real motivation was the course or
Right.
the guys I was going to play with, those are trivial gifts versus meaningful gifts. And that's that lane one versus the other two lane discussion. Does that help frame it for all of our listeners?
I think so. Now, the one thing I want to ask about is, because we're going to get into lane two. Lane two is obviously very people intensive in terms of resources that a nonprofit has to plan for, because you're going to get out of the office, you're going to have coffee with people, and there are many gifts who start in lane one who are meaningful, maybe not the first gift, but who sometimes they are, who remain meaningful, sometimes for 20 years until you get a gift in a will of people. Because we look at a lot of donor files. You have a core group of donors who give year after year after year, sometimes 3 to 9 gifts in a year, engage with the cause, don't want to be a lane 2 donor. And maybe they want to, but they're giving $500 a year. And a nonprofit might go, whether it's right or wrong, a nonprofit has realities they're facing, and they might go, well, a $500 donor is lovely, and we love that donor for what they do. Not worth a coffee. And I know I'm being a little bit facetious here, but that is the reality. Is that you have to decide where to put your resources, right? How do you make that distinction?
Right. So it's important to have this conversation in terms of resources, not just in terms of numbers.
Right.
And it's one of the places where we very much resonate with you that lane one operations are tactical and technical and can be executed really well by professional third parties. Lane two can only be done by the employee, the executive, or the fundraiser. Getting that donor engaged with that person. Now, this is where I'm an old guy. I'm almost 60 now, and in my worldview, if I don't sit down and have coffee with you, we didn't have a meeting, right? That's the way I was trained back in the late 80s. That's how I was taught the business. And the reality is, since the pandemic, we've all learned that you and I don't need to have ever met, and we can have a meaningful conversation that is positive for both of our organizations and all the people around us in this format. So when you say that $500 donor doesn't want to be a lane 2 donor, I'd say if they're giving $500 every year, they probably are a lane 2 donor. We need to find a way to more meaningfully communicate with them one-to-one, and entice them out of the one-to-many. And one of our problems is if we say, well, you got to have coffee with me or it's not one-to-one, maybe one-to-one is just meaningful emails.
Right. Yeah.
Maybe one-to-one is a chat. Maybe it's a video call. Maybe it's something else. And I think we get ourselves caught up, and this is one of the problems with technology. Well, it's got to be this or it's not that. Well, no. The question is, what's the intentionality of the donor? They gave the first gift, and then we entice them into this other relationship. Now, let's circle back to your question about resources. From our standpoint, once you've identified 100 people who want to have a one-to-one relationship, you need somebody to manage those. Now, it's a little bit of a chicken or the egg. I get that. Do I hire the person and have them find the 100, or do I find the 100 and then hire the person? Right. but there's a challenge there, right? And we've gotten ourselves caught up in a trap where we say, well, a fundraiser will cost this many $1,000, and therefore the donors they manage have to generate this many $1,000. Maybe we need to rethink what the real job of that lane 2 fundraiser is. And this is a place where I work with Jason Lewis, who's the founder of our organization. Jason wrote this book a couple years ago called The War for Fundraising Talent. And he talks in that book about how we've gotten ourselves caught up in this guru kind of mindset where I've got to hire a 50-year-old with gray hair who can steward my highest powerful donors.
Yeah.
Maybe I only need a 27-year-old who can go to coffee with the $500 donors. Maybe that 27-year-old I can hire at a price point that'll allow them to meaningfully engage the $500 donor. This is really important in these mid-sized shops, or we often call them executive director who fundraises shops,
Yeah,
where they don't have a full-time person, right?
Yep.
So we've got to figure out what portion of that executive's time can be spent stewarding the highest value donors, and how can we hire them someone at the lower pay scale that can allow that lower pay scale person to steward, using a term from the church world, to steward that $500 person, as you pointed out, for the 20 years till they make an estate gift.
Right.
If I have coffee with them periodically, if I meaningfully answer their emails or phone calls. And I think that's the distinction that I'm excited by the modern world, this post-pandemic world we're in, because it's forced us to rethink what one-to-one communication means.
Yeah, I'm glad you clarified that, because there is a bit of an I don't know what you call it. There's a bit of this divide between like annual giving or individual giving, whatever you want to call it, and then major gift fundraising, where in reality it's kind of this one big team, and lower gifts can be very meaningful for donors.
Mm-hmm.
They don't come across as meaningful to us because we haven't taken the time to find out if they are meaningful.
We never asked.
Because we never asked, right? And at the same time, some gifts are not meaningful at all, and we just go like, no, of course they're meaningful. Like they came to the golf event or they came to the gala. Like they wouldn't have given if they didn't care, right? So it happens on both ends where we actually never take into consideration how are we going to find out if this is meaningful to the donor.
And that's the real game, right? Yeah. If I can hire a young person, even right out of college, I can hire a young person and have them reach out to those first-time donors and say, thank you. I truly want to thank you for this gift. Can I ask why you made the gift? Can I ask what it was about what was it about our mailing? What was it about our emailing? What was it about our event that caused you to want to make the gift? And let's be honest, a lot of those people are going to say, it was no big deal. It was just, you caught me on the right day.
Yep.
I wrote a check, right? Other people are going to say, because I've always cared about fill in the blank, whatever the cause is. And then that we call them an MGO, a major gift officer, that fundraising person on the staff can say, wow, let's talk more.
Right. Yeah.
And that's that relational responsive part that somehow we lose because all of our people that we're employing are too busy worrying about the direct mail or worrying about the list management or worrying about the case for support or which photo are we going to put on the envelope or what color scheme are we going to use at the gala. That stuff, we can let somebody else worry about that stuff. I need people that can really talk to donors.
Yep. Absolutely. And if somebody's listening to this and they're thinking, oh man, we're so invested in direct mail, whatever it is, and like this is going to take a mindset shift or this is whatever, there are things that you can start with. We've done mailings asking for thousands of dollars, and we sent it to the entire file just to see who would raise their hand. And people do, and then now that's your chance to doesn't mean that if the gift is really big, it's meaningful, but it's one way you can at least start to sort out, okay, who might be ready for a more meaningful relationship.
Sure, and there's an infinite number of ways. So I have been, for a good portion of my adult life, my career, I've been leading sales and marketing teams, more sales teams than marketing teams. And invariably, a new salesperson will say, well, who should I call?
Right.
And my answer is, it doesn't really matter. Come up with whatever system you want. Call the people that have given the most consistently. Call the people that have made the largest gift. Call the people that are closest to your apartment. I don't care. It's more important that you go thank a bunch of people, and you will learn through that process what works and what doesn't in your unique circumstance.
Yep.
I also think it's really important to understand that the person making that thank you call needs to be energized by the mission. This idea that fundraising is some kind of a secret skill, and if I can do it for you, I can do it for anybody.
Yeah.
I personally am really invested in certain urban care, human care ministries in my community. I live downtown Chicago, and we have a lot of problems in Chicago, and I'm personally motivated by those. I would be really bad working for the art museum or the zoo or the history museum.
Right.
I love all those institutions. I'm actually a donor to some of them, but I'm not engaged enough to go talk to donors about it. But I can go talk to donors about what's happening to our kids on the street right now, because that really gets me fired up.
Yeah.
You need to find the person that gets really passionate about your thing, because that comes through in their conversation with the donor when they find the donor that's equally passionate.
Yeah. And those people don't always have a fundraising background, and they don't
Correct.
always have a degree, and they don't always have all of these things that we look for in fundraisers. In fact, they might already be working for you, not in fundraising.
Very often. We just finished an engagement with a inner city school in Oklahoma City where there were employees of the school who had the capability and the passion to go meet with donors.
Yeah.
And we built a program for that institution to say, this is how we're going to use these people. This is how we're going to direct them and how we're going to measure them and how we're going to compensate them to do that work. Now, that requires a strategic level of thinking by the agency to understand that I can't load that person up with a bunch of other junk. I use the word junk. The stuff Mike does, I can't have that person who I hired thinking they were going to talk to donors spend all their time worrying about the direct mail list.
Yeah.
I need to outsource that direct mail list so that this person I found can do this other thing.
Yeah, and just to be clear, you should put whoever you hire, even if you do it in-house, you should put a lot of love and care and thought into direct mail. This this stuff about the annual fund needs to die. Donor renewal letters, that needs to die. You should still put a lot of heart into it, but the personal stuff you need to do in-house. You know, Michael, over 10 years ago, I was running radiothons for an organization, and they are by far my least favorite thing. But, local community organization, they were very successful, and we needed all hands on deck. And so we got program people to help answer phone calls when donors are making calls. And all of a sudden, people who up until that point had been in a loving way fighting with me because they didn't like fundraising, they didn't like the fact that, why do you have to tell stories all the time, whatever. They were starting to pick up phones and having conversations with donors, and donors sometimes moved to tears by a testimonial they had just heard. And all of a sudden, my ears perked up, and I was like, this guy's a really good fundraiser. He has no idea that he's fundraising right now. He hates fundraising, but he's the best person on the phones that we've got.
So it's fascinating you bring that up, right? Because one of the challenges of getting people into fundraising is they push back against one of two different ideas. One is asking people for money, the actual ask.
Yeah.
The other is the prospecting. I got to make 100 phone calls to find 10 people that'll talk to me. Well, here's the good news. If your lane one, donor acquisition, is working, if your direct mail, direct response, email, whichever channel you're using, whether it's online giving days or events or whatever, if it's working correctly, it brings in new names and new donors who at least are a higher probability than the phone book.
Right.
And we have to take a moment and explain to some of our younger listeners, they used to print these books with phone numbers in them. I don't think I've seen one in a generation, but I still use it in my story, right? You get the idea, though. People don't want to hear no 100 times to get the one yes. Well, if you're calling people that have already given a first gift, yes, many of them will say, trivial gift, trivial interaction, not a big deal to me.
Yeah. Don't even remember donating half the time.
I don't remember it, whatever.
Yep.
But a much higher proportion will at least entertain the conversation. Then your job as the lane 2 person is to grow that relationship.
Yeah.
Or determine that it's not a lane 2 donor. This is really a trivial donor, and that's good. We need those.
Yeah.
But somehow, so I guess where we at Responsive get the most energized is when we see somebody that has put all their resources into lane one activities,
Yeah.
and in fact overheats their organization. They get too many responses, too many initial gifts. They can't react enough. They can't discern. They can't sift. They can't figure out, and they just trust that lane one will take care of it for them.
Yep.
Lane one does what lane one's supposed to do. One of the things it's supposed to do is generate lane two opportunities.
Yeah. There are some very big nonprofits who are way too overinvested in lane one and direct marketing, who have a poor retention rate. And I want to get into retention rate because it's not necessarily the thing that matters the most, but who have a super poor retention rate, but that direct marketing engine is just spinning money in year out. Doesn't mean it always will, and probably means they're leaving a lot of money on the table by not moving those folks to lane two or lane three. But
well, they're missing the larger gifts that those donors could be making if they were relationally engaged.
Yeah.
They also, this is something we talk about a lot, is in the last 22 years, 25 years, let's say, we have seen in the broad economy at least 3 times when everything changed.
mm-hmm.
9/11 and the dot-com bubble, which kind of happened at the same time, the mortgage meltdown of 08-09, and then the COVID response. In all of those cases, everything that you thought you knew about how things worked was turned upside down. And so if you were over-invested in something that you thought was going to work forever, and then everything turned upside down, you didn't have the safety net of the lane two donors who were meaningfully engaged.
Yeah.
And that's something that we, if you were relying on galas and golf outings and then you weren't allowed to interact face to face with anybody, you were in big trouble. And I know you invented virtual events, and I get all of that, but it wasn't as safe and it wasn't as secure as a more diversified approach.
Yep, absolutely. And now we're, depending on what you believe, who you listen to, what indicators you're looking at, very likely sort of heading into a bit of a rocky year with inflation, potential recession, who knows. But this stuff, we're in a 2 to 3 to 4 sort of year period here where everything has changed. And organizations who got close to donors or who were close to donors before already just thrived, right?
Well, it's interesting. Yeah. So my partner Jason Lewis has a podcast called the Fundraising Talent podcast, and he dropped an episode just recently where they talked about the fact that during the pandemic, donors, because they were locked at home just like we were more willing to engage in conversations.
Yeah.
They couldn't meet face to face because none of us were allowed to do that. But many clients of ours saw more email questions. They more times they made phone calls, the phone call was picked up.
Yeah. Because
people had less to do. They weren't traveling, they weren't doing this, they weren't busy with whatever. If you already had a relational contact, it got much deeper, much quicker.
Mm-hmm.
If you didn't, you were stuck trying to figure out how I'm going to turn this direct response thing into an engagement.
Right.
And that's the risk you run then, right?
We had one client who called every single donor on file during the first 6 months of the pandemic. Every single donor. $20 gift,
Great.
$20,000 gift.
Doesn't matter.
And they said, we have a duty of care to check in on these people because they showed up for us, so we're going to show up for them. And they basically just asked one question, which is like, hey, can we pray for you?
Right.
That's it.
I was working with a number of congregations in various church denominations. A number of them did things like that. Just call every member, regardless of their giving pattern. Just call every member and just ask, "Do you need anything from us?"
Yep.
Do you need a ride somewhere? Do you need somebody to get you groceries? Do you need And these are hyper local because they're community worship centers.
Right.
But that's powerful, right? And those people will remember that. And I think they will come back and be more vibrant as donors in the future.
Yeah. The other thing we need to remember is we talked about the big shops doing like overinvest in direct marketing. The $50 donor in your file might be a $50,000 donor at the local parish or at the or somewhere else, right? They might just be Now, I want to talk about a little bit in metrics and what to measure, and then I want to get into a very concrete example of moving from lane one to lane two. So let's start here. A lot of nonprofits worry about the renewal rate of donors in lane one. It's an easy thing to measure. It's an easy thing to sort of, there's a lot of talk in the sector about how awful we are, how bad is our stewardship, the renewal rates. But we're mostly talking about lane one renewal rates, where some of the donors you attracted were never going to renew anyways. That's just the nature of that work. And yeah, so so if you're getting an 18% renewal rate, that might actually be good. So and you're talking about, we just got to work harder to renew some of these folks. Now, oftentimes, it's easier to fret about that stuff than it is about creating a solution to moving people to lane two. You outlined a few reasons. I can imagine there's two reasons why nonprofits don't engage in that as much. One is it's kind of scary because only a fraction of lane one donors will move into lane two. And that's okay. You don't need them all to move to lane two. And then the second reason is a lot of fundraisers aren't even hired to do that kind of work because it's hard work. It's uncomfortable. You probably face a decent amount of rejection. It's probably a lot of elbow grease. You got to make a lot of phone calls, like you said. You got to figure out the system. And we don't pay them enough to perform that kind of work sometimes. And especially right now in the job market, which might change, but right now it's tough to find people. How do you see that in your work?
Well, so I mean, I think it's really critical. We have fallen in a trap of measuring renewal rates because they're easy to measure, and they give us a comfort of seeing a percent and putting it on the wall, right? I think you did a nice job of describing the fact that whatever your rate is, measuring your rate is a good thing to do, and seeing if it changes materially over time is a good thing to do. Measuring yourself against somebody else is kind of wacky because their lane one is different than yours. Their circumstance is different than yours. I just wrote to a prospect last night. I think I wrote this email to a prospect where I said, metrics are not a good thing to do when you're startup or in a time of radical change.
Right.
And by that, I don't mean that you shouldn't measure, but I mean you shouldn't compare yourself to dissimilar organizations. And finding true peer institutions is really hard to do.
Yeah.
Right. Maybe I could do it because I know thousands of people, but finding the comparable is hard. Now, measuring it over time, not a bad idea, but much more important than that is how many did I move into lane two? What was my actual conversion rate to a donor who will communicate with me one-to-one? That's the first hurdle. Who will entertain an ask? Who will make a multi-year commitment? And you did a very good job of describing what we call the messy middle lane. That middle lane, that lane two, that's hard work. I got to pick up the phone and call somebody. I have to go out and meet them face to face or visually meet them online, which means I've got to secure their undivided attention. Yeah. Then I have to have a conversation with them, which is also really powerful. I got to listen to their story, and their story may be not a real good one. They may not have a positive feeling about me or about my agency or about my cause. But over time, so when you said what are the metrics we should measure instead? How many lane ones am I getting? How many lane ones am I getting to communicate one-to-one? How many of those can I get into a real meeting? Of the meetings I get, how many are second or third meetings versus first meetings? Now, that has less to do with the donor and more to do with the skill of the fundraiser.
Right.
Right? When I find a person who's working in lane two who gets tons of first meetings and no second meetings, it tells me they're not good at relating.
Right. Yep.
Right? They don't really gain any trust and confidence in the donor. But I want to see a lot of first meetings because that's how I start. But I want to see a lot of subsequent meetings too because that's where I grow my actual capacity.
Right.
And you mentioned this idea of how much do people give and where else do they give, right? We're seeing a lot of of lost opportunity because there's an unrealistic reliance upon what we call in the States wealth screening, right? Which I think you don't have in Canada.
It's a lot harder in Canada. We're not big fans of it. Yeah, but
Well, and we aren't big fans of it for a whole bunch of reasons, because it distracts you from the relationship.
right. Yep.
Right? It doesn't matter how much you gave. My goal is to get you to give more
Yeah.
and get you to feel better about your giving.
Yeah.
How much wealth you have is not exactly relevant to that.
Yeah.
And a lot of my work in my career has been in the banking industry, and I can tell you wealth screening is a whole lot less accurate than most fundraisers think it is. That's just
Sure.
speaking as a financial industry professional.
Yeah, I should clarify. The reason we're not big fans is less to do with the fact that it's not even that easily available in Canada. It's more so how much money somebody has might not be meaningful at all to where to how they see what their wealth is for. Some people have a lot of money. They don't think their wealth is for philanthropy or for your cause. And so we advise people to lead donors toward making their best gift to your organization. And wealth screening just has very little to do with that. You're going to have some very wealthy people who their best gift to your organization is $5,000. I used to do lane 2 work. I used to meet with people who I knew had the capacity to give millions, who I met with very frequently and year after year, who would tell me, your organization, we're going to do $10,000 this year. And here's why. And we could do a lot more. We're doing a lot more elsewhere. But for your organization, here's what we want to do. And so the wealth screening in that case would be completely useless.
Right.
Because somebody would give me a $50,000 gift who had way less capacity than the other person who was giving me a $10,000 gift. It was just about finding the meaningful story that resonated with them, that contributed to their own well-being, that gave them meaning behind what is my wealth for, and what do I want my legacy to be? What are my values? Does that match with what you're trying to achieve?
Yeah. It's critically important to understand why they give and where they give and what do they want to know their gift will fulfill. And when we talk about lane 2, we're talking about meaningful gifts that are not designated gifts.
Right.
That's really we didn't get this far in my overview at the beginning, but for us, lane 3 is a designated gift. It's a capital gift. It's a gift to start a program, to put my name on something. That's a designated gift. Lane 2 is unrestricted, multi-year, meaningful amounts.
Right.
Meaningful in the eyes of the giver. So it could be that $500 a year that's a response to your annual fund letter. That might be a meaningful gift to a lot of people. And if you engage them the right way, you might get a lot more in their estate.
Yeah, right. Yeah. All right, so let's go through a bit of an example of somebody listening to this. They might be with you, right? Okay, I gotcha. I need to move people from lane 1 to lane 2. That makes total sense. Let's say that the organization is holding an event. And let's say that the people who organized the event were actually very thoughtful about it. It's not a golf event. It's not one of those events that is based around a raffle or a lottery. And it's, the event is about the mission. The offer at the event is to support the mission. Is to make a philanthropic gift to support the mission. It's not to buy something at a silent auction. It's not any of that, right? And so the gifts that we're getting, we could say they are a little bit more mission aligned than they might be at a raffle or auction or theme party or whatever crazy stuff people come up with, right? And so let's say we walk away from this event with about 200 new donors on file. We've got 200 new names. They made a gift at this event. At this point, they're lane 1 donors. How do we lead them toward lane 2? Walk me through, in your framework, what would happen next?
Well, so before I answer that, I want to say the one other thing that is absolutely true in fundraising and in other things. Any event-based marketing needs to have as its highest priority getting the right people in the room, and as its second highest priority, having the capacity to follow up with them. Right? In this particular scenario you've painted, we have 200 new names. So I would be very concerned that the Monday morning after the event, there is sufficient capacity in the office of the agency to get those names into the database, to code them appropriately so that they get the direct mail, the direct response in whatever plan exists for that, to keep them alive in lane one.
Mm-hmm.
Then I also want sufficient human capital capacity to be able to look at the 200 and say, which are the first 20 I'm going to call? And I said earlier in this call, quite frankly, if somebody asked me, who should I call first? I don't care, call anybody. But realistically, you have 200 names. Who invited them? What table did they sit at? If you have wealth screening, great, use it at this moment, right? Is there anything else we know about them? Oh, this is somebody's nephew or somebody's niece or somebody's, right?
Yeah.
Maybe, right? Whatever criteria we could imagine. And you can be overly analytical about this or completely random. But at the end of the day, call 20 of them and ask them to have coffee. Well, yeah, you call 20 of them and say thank you, and then ask them to have coffee.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So at that level, it's, we can put a lot of brain power into it or not. What's important from a skill development standpoint, and this is the other part of the responsive message, is it's great to have an energetic person who'll dial the phone and set up the coffee meetings, but you need a framework or a format for what they're going to do when they get there.
Right.
And we put forward a plan, it's in Jason's first book, of 5 major questions that need to be asked. And if you can have a meaningful coffee meeting, virtual, face-to-face, lunch, I don't care what it is, a meaningful one-to-one communication where you ask these 5 questions. Tell me about where else you give. Tell me about why you give. Tell me about what wealth means to you. There's a series of these questions, and if you can position that conversation at the end of that first lane 2 interaction, you'll be able to determine what your follow-up plan is. Is it a good prospect, or is this really a lane 1 donor?
Mm-hmm.
It's all good either way.
Yeah.
There's no downside to this, right? But I mean, was that the kind of direction you were looking for with that question?
Sure, yeah. So we're going to use some sort of prioritization tool or series of tools. It can be wealth screening at this point, just to prioritize who do I call. It can be who brought them. It can be the size of the gift that they made at the event. People who made a larger gift,
Sure.
that might be a signal. It might be, who knows, that they were moved a little bit more by your mission. And then you're going to call those folks. The rest are hopefully going to get, we always advise all clients that everybody gets a thank you phone call. We have a client that has a big shop in terms of donors, but they have 8,000 volunteers who are involved with the organization throughout the year. And a lot of those people are retired people who love to get an Excel list on a Monday morning of 20 people to call. That's the perfect day for them. They get to connect with other people who care about the mission just like they do.
That's a critical distinction, which I didn't make earlier on. We have, you and I have each reflected that a lot of lane 1 work can and should be done by a third party that's a professional expert organization. A lot of lane 1 work is also really great for volunteers.
Yeah.
Super great for volunteers to do. Now, the real challenge in what you just described is, I'm going to have these volunteers make these thank you calls. I need to give them enough direction that they can find the nuggets of gold in that list. We give them 20 names. Do they have a feedback loop that says, hey, these 2 people seem like they really wanted to talk?
Right. Yep.
Right? And some kind of response loop on that. And just to be very clear, from an interpersonal skill-based training standpoint, the phone call is infinitely more valuable than the handwritten letter. The handwritten thank you note, everybody seems to think that's cool. It shows personal effort, but it is not communication. It doesn't go both directions.
Yeah.
The donor receives it and goes, oh, they have a volunteer that has good cursive handwriting. That's not, But the donor doesn't get to say anything back to you in a hard in the mail, Canada Post, whatever, right?
Yeah.
You put it in the mail. It's one direction. It doesn't go both ways.
Yep.
So the phone call is critical, and I think that's key.
Yeah, and volunteers do need training, absolutely. And the reason we liked for volunteers to be involved in some of this stuff is because one of the definitions of community, the way we see it, is communion. And I mean communion not in the religious sense, although you and I both are very familiar with that.
Right.
But communion as in like communing with each other, and like people in the religious sense, it would be congregants communing with each other, not just the person in the parish at the front or the pastor or whatever. Like it is actually people in the community communing with each other. And so when donors start to talk to each other without the charity involved, we always see it as a positive if you can create some of those bonds and those connections.
So that bumps up against a new idea that we've been talking about a lot, and will be a big part of Jason's next book, which is this idea of citizen behavior as opposed to commercial behavior.
Right.
Your example, you did a really good job of outlining. This event was mission focused. It wasn't an auction or a raffle or a golf outing or a concert. It was mission focused, right? And we're spending a lot of time trying to get our clients and the broader industry to think about your lane one behavior. What is it citizen like? I want you to be part of a community, or is it commercial like? Send me $50 and I'll send you the coffee mug and the T-shirt, right? And
Right.
I've got a lot of public radio coffee mugs. That's a big thing in the States. Coffee mugs and tote bags. Tote bags are really big, right?
Yep.
And the auction problem is huge, right?
Yeah.
The auction, somebody writes a check for a really big item at an auction. Was that really mission motivated?
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm not saying it's not mission motivated, but I'm saying we're not sure.
Yeah, it's a lot easier to go get a mug printed than think about what is something emotionally valuable I can provide to the donor.
Good point.
And that's unfortunately, and premiums. I know that people will say premiums work, right? The increased response. They might adjust. I don't take an issue with that. We don't use premiums because we are always thinking about what's the emotional value we can provide rather than sort of the physical value. But in terms of lane one, even in lane one, we're always just so worried and concerned about like what is the story a donor will get out of this to tell themselves about the kind of person they are, rather than what is the tote bag or the mug that they're going to get out of it.
Right.
So we're almost at the end of our conversation here, and
Sure.
I just want to loop back to. So we've had this event. We had 200 people. We called 20 of them. You gave us a helpful framework to think about how to measure success, which is just measure how many meetings are you booking, and then how many subsequent meetings are you booking, like second or third meetings. What else is there anything else that we should be tracking if we want to set up a really simple dashboard? If we just want to start doing some things a little bit differently, is there like 3 or 4 things that we just want to be looking at?
Right. So a couple additional thoughts on this. Another metric that we think is critically important is, of the subsequent meetings, how many engaged a person other than the fundraiser? And by this I mean the fundraiser goes out, and on meeting 2 or 3, they've learned enough about the donor to see that the donor really cares about this part of the mission or this part of the operation. And so on meeting 3, they bring a program officer, or they bring the CFO, or they bring a facility manager, or whatever the mission might be, right? Or maybe it's a facility tour, not a coffee meeting on meeting 3. We call that subs in teams, subsequent meetings in teams. Now, we think that's important for a whole bunch of reasons. It means the fundraiser doesn't have to know everything.
Right.
It also means people other than the fundraiser know the donor, and the donor knows people other than the fundraiser. This is just safety for the agency, that if the fundraiser leaves, I don't lose my personal connection. I have other people that have interacted, right?
Yep.
This is super neat. We have a client who just changed jobs, and the new position he took is building a school in Central America. He's raising the money in the States to build this school in Central America. And as they're making the job offer, they say, well, you'll need to get down to the school site so you can learn about it. And he looked at them and said, do you want to hire somebody who knows everything about your school site? Or do you want to hire someone who knows everything about how to raise money to build your school? And he said, it's not that I'm not going to go there. It's that I'm not going to go there first. I'm not going to spend the first month of my employment learning everything there is to know at the agency, because I'm going to use teamwork instead of assuming I have to know it all. So I think that's one of the other metrics we like. We also think it's critically important, as we said, this is the messy middle lane. We want people soliciting multiple year unrestricted gifts. So we want to measure how many meetings had an ask versus didn't have an ask. You shouldn't ask on every meeting. Then they think you only come to see them when you're asking. And some of your asks should be your annual gift this year. And some of the gifts should be, I'd really like to see you step forward and be a leadership donor at this multi-year commitment level. So those are some other metrics. Now, those don't come into play at the beginning. And one of the challenges we feel goes on in the space is, and this is a particular problem at the small, mid-sized shop, we finally realize we've got to hire a fundraiser. We hire one, and then we measure them on dollars in the door. Your lane 2 donor, or your lane 2 fundraiser will never pay for themselves at the beginning. You're planting seeds that you will harvest many quarters forward. So you've got to have the capacity to say, yep, I'm going to hire this person. They're going to take a bunch of people to coffee. And in 6 or 9 or 12 or 18 months, this thing's really going to start to spin. But at the beginning, you're building those. You started this entire conversation nearly an hour ago and said it's about being one-to-one instead of one-to-many. And that allows you to hyper-focus and position your agency to the unique desires of that donor. What do they really want to accomplish, either in the world or with their wealth? Either way, but give them that opportunity to make a difference.
Yeah, I love that. I've got a sticky note on my computer. Our podcast listeners can't see it, but it says measure the input and then evaluate the outcome, rather than measure the outcome, which is just measure what you're putting into the thing, and worry about doing that consistently. And then consistency over time will produce an outcome. You evaluate the outcome, but the thing you're going to measure is what you're putting in.
Our KPI for major gift officers is 14 inputs. And it never asks how much money did they raise. It asks what were the intentional behaviors they did. And it's all outlined in that War for Fundraising Talent book, so nobody has to pay me to get the KPIs. They might want to pay me to help figure out how to make it special for them. But the book lays out all of these frameworks and does a really deep dive to explain what the 3 lanes are and how they work. And that book is by Jason Lewis.
Well, this has been great, Michael. Thank you so much for coming on the show and getting into this. I don't know if this is helpful at all. I know you're trying to get away from a sales analogy, but a lot of the stuff that you're talking about, really great sales teams do, which is that SDRs only prospect, and once they've prospected, they pass that on to an account executive who then takes over that relationship. And the moment it looks like it might be a sale, the account executive brings in the account manager who they're going to be working with, which is subs and teams, right? And this is just stuff that makes a lot of sense. And somehow we're expected, nonprofits, like leaders, to like give them one hat and expect that to be 1,000 hats. And you're going to do it all. You're going to be the person who solicits the first gift. Then you're going to be the person who does, the follow-up meeting, and you're going to write the letter, and you're going to write the email. And somehow you're supposed to hold all of this together. And it just, it makes no sense. If anybody's listening to this, if you're in a job where you have to do both, you have to do lane 1, lane 2, and possibly lane 3 work, that's a bit of a red flag that things are not sustainable for you personally. And likely for your organization as well.
And probably we would say one of the reasons there's so much turnover in the industry is it's a burnout factor. The person gets hired because they love one of those components, then they get all of them dumped on top of them, and then the output measurement drives them to be unfulfilled. And so we're very focused on helping our clients hire the right people, measure them correctly, and therefore be successful in retaining the fundraiser, which then retains the donor.
Yeah. We ask every guest on this show, do you have a piece of advice for all the fundraisers, leaders, marketers who are listening to this show, who are doing the work day in, day out of building good in our communities?
Well, I'm passionate about one-to-one communication. That's where I am, and that's why Jason and I resonate so well together. I think it's critically important. I had a couple of college graduates, people that graduated just in the last few weeks, come to me because they wanted mentorship to get into the business. And I urged them to find a job where they would have direct donor communication, where they would be one-to-one.
Yep.
And I think the broader concept of that is what you just pointed out. Figure out which of the lanes you are most passionate about, and then get yourself into an agency or into a job title where that's the part you're doing. Because if you're really passionate about doing direct response, find an organization that's super focused and motivated to do great direct response. That might be a third party like yours, Mike, or it might be a big shop that has a big lane one operation. But know yourself and know what you're looking for, and then channel yourself into a role that feeds that, so you're motivated and excited about your career.
Yeah, that's great advice. Find something that you really want to do, and realize you're part of a team, and there's other people who are really passionate about something else. And if everybody does their job, this whole thing sings beautifully.
It's a great feeling when everything's working, right?
Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Michael. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. This has been a great time. I will say I was told that I should have had the song "I Hate Winnipeg" playing in the background.
Oh, we're you are the first American I've talked to who knows that song.
Fortunately, I have Canadian friends.
Okay. Sounds good. Yeah. For those who don't get that obscure reference, you can look up a band called the Weaker Thans. And
I was in a board meeting yesterday. The fellow sitting next to me is from somewhere up that way. I don't think it was exactly Winnipeg, but he's from. He is ancestrally related to your part of the world.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks, Michael. Really appreciate it.
I appreciate it, Mike. Thank you very much.